Hello everyone. I would like to welcome you to Berlin. My name is Michael Bienert and today I will take you to a virtual tour through the history of the city. May I just give you some information about my person first. I'm a historian and since several years I've been working as a general manager of the Ernst Reuter Archives Foundation. This foundation is part of the Berlin State Archive. We do research on the history of the city, especially to the history in the 19th and 20th century. We publish books, we organize workshops and conferences, and we offer academic advice. So I think that's all we do. In normal times, we would take this tour together, but pandemic things are as they are, and we have to make the most out of it. We can also say that this virtual tour has a big advantage because we are not restricted to a special point, but we can jump right across the city as we like, and that's exactly what we intend to do. So I will bring you several sites of the Cold War in Berlin to your kitchen table, and into your living room, and you can just relax and can have a gin tonic or a cup of coffee. So it doesn't get any better, can't it? First, let's talk about some general things, because they are important to understand our topic in a broader sense. What is so special about Berlin? Well, obviously there are many ideas on that, and at the moment we can just reduce ourselves on one aspect. At the beginning of the 20th century, the art historian Karl Scheffler said that Berlin is not a completed city, but it is always a city in the making. The feeling of the city in the making is still today present. In fact, there are probably only a few cities in the world that have undergone so many changes, fundamental changes, like Berlin in the last 200 years. And in most cases, these changes were explained by political changes. Until 1850, Berlin was a relatively manageable, cozy, average, or let's say boring city. Its roots were somewhere in the Middle Ages, and since that time, things hadn't changed that much. But then industrialization came, and it changed everything. Within a few decades, the city was bursting, and its population was exploding. New means of transport, such as the subway or the car, transformed the city. In 1920, Berlin became the third largest metropolis in the world after London and New York. It counted 4 million inhabitants. During these very dynamic decades, a large part of the old building structures disappeared, and the city expanded far into its surrounding area. In 1933, the Nazis came to power. We all have heard from the tremendous redesign plans by Hitler and his architect Albert Speer, who wanted to make Berlin the world capital Germania. Then, of course, we think of the Second World War, which transformed large parts of the city into a huge landscape of rubble. Just take a look at this photo. It shows the city center in 1945. Hardly anything remained standing. Incredible. After the end of the war, the reconstruction followed, but this was connected with different political developments in East and West Berlin and the division of the country. The construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961 drew a depth strip several hundred meters wide right through the very heart of the city. We will talk about that later. In fact, in that time, we were dealing with two cities that developed independently in political, economic, cultural and social terms. But nevertheless, they were always mutual references and links existing.
We have lived in the shadow of the wall for more than a year. It cuts through the heart of Berlin. We have learned to live with it. We refuse to think that it will always be this way. In the beginning, we waved across the wall to our families in East Berlin. It didn't matter who watched us. But later, the communist policemen came and stopped our families from waving. My mother lives over there. They'll move her away if she dares to wave. It's forbidden. I speak to my children in East Berlin with hand signals, making certain the guards are not watching. I don't want them to harm my family. We have become good with our signals. At dusk, the communists have a hard time tracking us down, but we take chances, especially on nights when an escape is planned. In the beginning, many people escaped in broad daylight by jumping out of windows facing the western sector of the city. Our firemen were there to help. We remember the woman being held by communist guards to prevent her from joining her family. They even threw tear gas at those who were below, ready to catch her. That's when they decided to extend the wall and cut access to the buildings facing West Berlin. They sealed every window. Many bricklayers came over to our side of the wall rather than do that kind of job. They strung barbed wire on the roofs to close off another way of escape. Many homes along their side of the wall were razed. They blinded us with reflecting mirrors. They threw tear gas. They tried everything to keep us away. We threw the tear gas grenades back at them. They laid minefields in the countryside. They increased their patrols. They planted new watchtowers. But we watched them too, and soon learned their weak spots. Entire families escaped, women and babies. We were waiting for them. "12,000 people escaped in the first year of the war. Our loudspeakers told the communist guards that to shoot a refugee was murder, that they would be held accountable, that they could not claim orders from higher up. Murder is always murder.
Mord bleibt Mord.
On a Friday afternoon, they shot an 18-year-old boy as he was trying to scale the wall into West Berlin. They let him bleed to death on their side of the wall. Then they took his lifeless body and took him away. His name was Peter Fechter. He was an apprentice bricklayer. We mourned him on our side of the wall, a few yards from where he fell. Peter Fechter was one of 50 people who died trying to escape during the first year of the war. We mourn them all. We honor their names. They will be remembered as long as we live. At 12 o'clock on August 13th, on the anniversary of the war, West Berlin paused for 3 minutes of silence. We still wave to our families in East Berlin, and they still dare to wave back. We cannot be together.
After reunification in 1990, the question arose of how the two halves of the city could be brought together again. Now began a decade that was a golden age for urban planners, architects and traffic experts. Berlin was transformed into the largest construction site in the world. In fact, the city has not come to rest to this day. Berlin is still changing. Today, certainly other issues are on the table than the dispute over democracy or dictatorship, over freedom or communism. It is about the question of social coexistence, about living conditions, work, urban displacement, basic services, culture, identity, about migration and much, much more. These discussions show that the story of Berlin has not come to an end and that the future is open. How did this guy, Karl Schäffler, say? Berlin isn't completed, it is always a city in the making. Okay, that was pretty abstract, wasn't it? Now, let's move on to something very real. The Brandenburg Gate, just behind me. In fact, it is the most famous landmark of Berlin. And if everyone would takes a picture of it would have to pay $1 for it, then the toilet bowls in Berlin would be made of pure gold. Well, I can assure you most of them are not. The original task of a Brandenburg Gate was that of a city gate. When the current building was erected around 1790, the town was literally over here. The area where today the Tiergarten Park extends didn't belong to Berlin anymore. The main purpose of the gate was to control the movements of goods into and out of Berlin and to collect the taxes for it. It was a toll station, but a very splendid one. The architect Karl Langhans designed the gate in a neoclassical style. Atop of the gate there is a sculpture made by Johann Gottfried Schadow, the Quadriga. It's a chariot drawn by 4 horses and driven by Victoria, the Roman Empress of Victory. It's all very stylish and nice. And so it's not surprising that during the 19th century this gate was given a very symbolic meaning. Napoleon entered Berlin through this gate after defeating the Prussians in 1806. Later, the Prussians won, and they used the gate again and again as a scenery for their victories on the battlefields. So did the Nazis when they came to power. To keep it short, this place had a very special meaning. But this meaning changed after the Second World War because the border between East Berlin and West Berlin ran exactly here. The gate was right on the front line of a Cold War. In the first years, it was possible to drive through the gate from West Berlin to East Berlin, but the gate increasingly became a symbol of a German's desire for unity. This poster from 1959 sums it up. Berlin, the capital of Germany, open the gate. With the construction of the Berlin Wall, the sight of a walled-in gate became even more absurd. A German politician later once said, "The German question is open as long as the Brandenburg Gate is closed." Well, I think that this sentence brought the problem to the point. How the story continued, we'll find out later. But first, we want to see another site. Okay, now we have arrived at our second stop, Checkpoint Charlie. I think that you've heard about this special place. In fact, Checkpoint Charlie is one of the best-known Berlin Wall sites in the capital, and it is one of the most famous tourist attractions. In 1945, the 4 Allied powers of World War II took joint control of Berlin. The whole city was administratively divided into 4 sectors, and each power was given one of these sectors. As you can see on the map, the French sector was to the north, the British sector to the west, the American to the south, and the eastern sector went to the Soviet Union. This arrangement had been agreed after long discussions, and its intention was to continue the war coalition against the Germans into the era of peace. The 4-way division of Berlin also corresponded to the way in which the entire country should be ruled. Each power in its area independently, but jointly in all general questions. That this concept couldn't work in the long run is another story. Checkpoint Charlie in the Friedrichstraße was the crossing point between the Soviet sector and the American sector, and it was designated as the single crossing point for foreigners and members of Allied forces in Berlin. By imposing strict regulations on their soldiers, the Allies wanted to have control over who crossed their sector boundaries, why and when. Shortly after the construction of the Berlin Wall, Checkpoint Charlie was twice the scene of dramatic incidents that made it into the news of the world press, and they both demonstrated the particular danger of a Cold War hotspot. The first incident occurred in October 1961. It started with a dispute over whether East German border guards were authorized to examine the travel documents of a United States diplomat who wanted to travel into East Berlin to watch an opera show there. According to the Allied agreements, the Americans only recognized the authority of the Soviets to do this examination. The thing rocked high. Some days later, 10 Soviet and an equal number of American tanks stood apart on either side of the checkpoint to underline their respective rights. The confrontation at Checkpoint Charlie was so dangerous because in this very tense situation anything could have happened. Fortunately, an understanding was reached and the Soviets and the Americans withdrew their tanks on the next day. The second incident occurred in August 1962. The 18-year-old teenager Peter Fechter was shot near the checkpoint by East German guards while he was trying to escape to the west. His body lay tangled in a barbed wire fence and he desperately called for help as he bled to death in full view of world's media. American soldiers couldn't rescue him because the boy was a few meters inside the Soviet sector. East German border guards were reluctant to approach him for fear of provoking Western soldiers. More than an hour later, Fechter's body was removed. These two incidents in 1961 and 62 had a major impact on the image of Checkpoint Charlie. Today, Checkpoint Charlie is a place that I personally see with very mixed feelings. On the one hand, there's no doubt that it is an important place of remembrance and of history. We find several monuments, for example, for Peter Fechter. There's also an interesting open-air exhibition and a museum. So far, so good. But on the other side, the place has something of a cheap Disneyland. I mean, the guardhouse that stands right behind me at the checkpoint today is not an original, but a replica. Countless souvenir shops, takeaways and shops offering all kinds of junk and so on have settled here. Of course, I'm aware that life has to go on and that people shall make their money. But the line between commemoration, dignity and kitsch is quite fluid. And that's all I want to say about that. Let's get to our next stop. This modest building behind me is the former Tempelhof airport. We could spend the whole day with talking about its special history and the special place, but I think at the moment we should reduce just to a few impressions. The Tempelhof airport is one of the oldest airports in Germany. And it is closely connected with the very special and interesting history of aviation in Berlin. Even before the First World War, flight experiments and races with balloons take place on the large parade ground here in Tempelhof. The airport itself was founded in 1923. Its beginning was very modest. Today there's nothing left from the first wooden buildings from that time. During the 1920s, a larger terminal was built, but today one can only guess the outlines of this building on Google Earth or from the air. Instead, the whole site is dominated by the monumental airport building that was started under the Nazis in the 1930s. It was part of Hitler's redesign plans for Berlin. The former airport is still known as one of the largest buildings in the world, but it has never been completed. Inside, there are some nooks and crannies that look as if the construction workers have just gone to get some beer. After the Second World War, the airport was part of the American sector. When the Soviet blockade began in 1948, the airport moved into the center of action. In order to force the Western Allies out of the city, Stalin had blocked off the water and land routes to Berlin. About these routes, agreements didn't exist between the four powers. Therefore, they were contestable. But with regard to the air routes, the situation was different, because the Allies had fixed 3 flight corridors to Berlin, and the Soviets didn't dare to dissolve these agreements. Soon, the Western Allies organized the supply of their troops and of a population in the western part of the city to a large extent by plane. The airlift was born. Even more than food, the most important task was to bring coal to Berlin, because coal was urgently needed to heat apartments in winter and to generate electricity. As is well known, the airlift turned out to be a big success.
This is a story of the Berlin Airlift, the operation carried out by the Royal Air Force and the United States Air Force to supply 2.25 million people of Berlin with food, coal, and other necessities of life. In June 1948, all road and rail communications between the Allied zones and the western sectors of Berlin were closed by the Russians. By the 28th of June, the only way into Berlin was by air, and the first RAF aircraft started this colossal undertaking. According to many predictions, an impossible one to maintain for any length of time, especially during winter. Aircraft began their ceaseless drone into blockaded Berlin, using all available airfields in the western zone. In the first 3 days, 500 landings were achieved, but with the aid of the United States Air Force, the number of flights rose by October to 600 per day. Sunderland flying boats of Coastal Command were ordered in to supplement the land-based planes. These took off from the Elbe at Hamburg and came down on one of Berlin's lakes. Food, still more food, and raw materials had to be poured across the aerial bridge into the blockaded city. Only one narrow corridor led from the base on the Elbe near Hamburg to the unloading base at Havel Lake in the British sector of Berlin. Within 4 days of the decision to use them, the first giant boats, each carrying 5 tons of vital material, were on air transport service.
You are clear to take off, over.
Soon winging their way daily over the port of Hamburg, destination Berlin.
Jolly, jolly sixpence, I've got sixpence to last me all my life. I've tuppence to spend and tuppence to lend and tuppence to send home to my wife. No cares have I to bring me, no pretty little girl to receive me. I'm happy as a king.
Past the Olympic Stadium, and presently over the only power station left working in the western sector. Immediately on landing, unloading commences, and the machines are prepared for the return journey.
I've got tuppence to last me all my life. I've tuppence to spend and nothing to lend and nothing to send home to my wife. No cares have I to bring me, no pretty little girl to deceive me. I'm happy as a king, believe me, as I go.
On the return trip, exportable freight was carried and the opportunity taken to remove some of Berlin's sick children for convalescence.
When the Soviet Union ended the blockade in May 1949, 70 American and British pilots had lost their lives. A memorial erected in front of the airport commemorates them.
This is Lieutenant Frank Grubbs, your military correspondent here in the European Command, reporting to you on one of the many activities of our armed forces in this part of the world. Today's report comes to you from Tempelhof Air Base in the center of the city of Berlin, the scene of the very famous Berlin airlift. The story of the airlift has been told many times, but today we're going to tell you of a new and unusual activity here. Now, landing just behind me is one of the helicopters who regularly patrol the western sectors of Berlin. Its pilot is Captain Mel Schumacher. We're going to talk with Captain Schumacher to learn the story of helicopters over Berlin. How do you do, Captain Schumacher?
How do you do?
Sir, you're from what part of the States?
Wyoming, Laramie, Wyoming.
Laramie, Wyoming. We'd like to ask you a few questions about your unit and about its mission here, if you don't mind answering them.
Oh, certainly, be glad to.
What is the designation of your unit, Captain?
This is the Army Aviation Section of the 6th Infantry Regiment.
Well, then you're not an Air Force unit based here, but an Army unit.
Definitely, we are an Army unit, but based on Tempelhof Air Base.
Captain, we know that infantry regiments have L-type, liaison-type planes. In this case, the 6th Infantry Regiment has helicopters. Will you tell us why?
There are two reasons. One, the peculiar characteristics of the area that we have to cover here in Berlin. There are 3 Allied sectors and approximately 3 million people congested, packed within these sectors. 2, the maneuverability of this aircraft allows us to hover, land, take off from small areas. Also, land in streets if it's necessary. It's an ideal ship for this type of work.
Could you tell us something about the history, the background of your unit?
Well, due to the mission we have to perform here, it was felt that an aircraft of this type would be, could be well adapted, and the authorization was granted, and this section was activated in May 1951. Since that date, we have been in continuous operation here.
A routine mission for these helicopter pilots may consist of patrolling the borders of the West Sector. The remains of the once proud Brandenburg Gate can be seen just over the border in the Soviet zone. The new marble structure is a memorial in honor of the Russian soldiers killed in the Second World War. It's an important job these helicopter pilots have, observing the activities of the people in the western part of Berlin. Pilots also help with special jobs of air observation, including missions for the Army engineers, and cooperating with the West Berlin police to see that the big city keeps running smoothly. Vital supply routes leading into the city, such as railway arteries, are checkpoints for the helicopter pilots. Power plants, too, are important to the city's well-being, as are the canals which play their part in the city's traffic flow. Yes, there are many useful jobs to be done by the versatile helicopters over Berlin.
For West Berliners, Tempelhof meant always more than just being an airport. It was their memory of a heroic time during the blockade. It was a reminder of a friendship with the Americans, and for a long time, the most important gateway to the world. In this respect, there was a great resistance when it became known that the airport was to be closed. In October 2008, the last plane started at THF. Since then, Large parts of the airport building have stood empty and unused. In fact, it is an enormous challenge to find an idea for a meaningful use of such a huge building without violating the monument protection. Well, and you should have enough money. The former airfield, however, has been converted into a giant park. The facility is particularly popular with young people who do their trendy, stylish sports here. They meet friends, they barbecue, and they relax and whatever you want. But whether this huge open space in the center of the city will stay that way forever, well, I think that's in the stars. I think now it's time for a short break. We have to change our place anyway, so we'll continue in about 10 minutes. I think that's a good time, and so we'll back in 10 minutes and bye. Hello, welcome back. I hope that you enjoyed the first part of our little tour through the history of Berlin. The second part now has more very exciting places for you, and I have saved the highlights for the end. As if by magic, it has been possible to get out of the city from Tempelhof and to reach the outer suburbs. 25 kilometers in 10 minutes, right through the rush hour. Well, I think this is my new, very personal record. Anyway, we are now in the extreme southwest of the city on the Havel River in Glienicke. On the other side of the river, there is Potsdam, which doesn't belong to Berlin. As you can see, this is an extremely beautiful spot. We can find several castles, parks, forests and lakes here. A very great site. But what we are really interested in now is right over there, the Glienicke Bridge. This bridge connects Berlin with Potsdam. The border between the two cities lies in the middle of the river. Funnily enough, you can tell the difference by the color of the bridge, because the Berlin side has not spent the money on a new coat of paint yet. During the Cold War, this was not only the border between two cities, but also the border of the Iron Curtain. Potsdam belonged to the GDR. That means to the Soviet bloc. While this side we are just standing on was part of the American sector of Berlin. Similar to the Brandenburg Gate and Checkpoint Charlie, this bridge was a place of a very special symbolic importance. Maybe you can compare it a little bit with that bridge of no return in Korea. Glienicke was particularly good for symbolic photos, a pretty backdrop that every viewer understood immediately. Here we see one of those pictures showing two West German politicians in the winter of 1962. But above all, the Glienicke Bridge became famous as a place where agents from the West and the East were exchanged. That is why it was also called the Bridge of Spies. The Americans and Soviets used it for the exchange of captured spies during the Cold War. The Cold War era was a time of intense espionage. Each side tried to obtain sensitive information and data from the other side about technical developments, troop deployments, army strengths and so on. But sometimes spies were exposed. Instead of shooting them immediately or to leave them to rot in prisons, of course there have been such cases, both sides switched to exchanging their prisoners. Between 1962 and 1986, a total of 40 agents were exchanged on the bridge. One of these agent stories was made into a movie by Steven Spielberg a few years ago with Tom Hanks in the main role. I like this place very much because it was here that the effects of great politics of the Cold War could be felt very directly. And on the other side of the river, not far from here, there's a wonderful French restaurant with a delicious coq au vin, cheese and fantastic red wine. But I think that's another story. Now we've reached the climax of our tour. I literally mean the highest point. We are here on the Kleiner Teufelsberg, that means the Little Devil's Mountain. It's an elevation that lies in the Grunewald in an extensive forest area in the west of the city, and it's getting a little bit stormy. But the view from here is really breathtaking. On the one side we have the city, on the other side there are forests and water as far as the eye can see. Marvelous. This place is particularly popular with families with little children who want to fly their kites, and with all those who just want to come up for a sundowner. But of course, there's also an interesting story to tell about this mountain. At the point where we are, the Nazis wanted to set up a large military college. But nearly nothing came of this for several reasons. Instead, after the Second World War, much of the rubble from the city was dumped here. In this way, two man-made mountains were created, the Little Teufelsberg and the Big Devil's Mountain. During the 1950s, the city government of West Berlin opted to plant greenery on the hill as a beautification project, and they created a ski jump. Skiing in Berlin, what a crazy idea. But in fact, ski jumping competitions were held here for a number of years. At the end of the 50s, the US National Security Agency built one of its largest listening stations atop the Teufelsberg, and that brings us back to the espionage issue. For Western Secret Services, West Berlin had a special meaning, because it lay like an island far within the Soviet sphere, far behind the Iron Curtain. Where could one better observe what was happening in Eastern Europe than here?
This is The Big Picture, an official report of the United States Army, produced for the armed forces and the American people.
In this post-war era of tension and conflict, American soldiers have had to take up posts all over the world. Today, they stand by their guns in silent readiness. All humanity prays they will never be needed. But until nations learn to live together in peace and in harmony, these guns and these missiles must remain poised. At home, Americans may feel secure, for everywhere their soldiers are on guard, listening to the wind with electronic ears, scanning the horizons with electronic eyes, alert to discover the first faint traces of sudden enemy movement. The men of the U.S. Army, standing between you and unexpected attack. And it is upon these men that all America must rely. The men behind the new electronic equipment, the men behind the guns.
The Devil's Mountain was ideal for a large field station for listening to Soviet, East German and other nations' military traffic. The Americans found that operations from atop Teufelsberg offered an improvement in listening ability. At the request of the United States government, the ski lifts had to be removed because they disturbed the signals. What a pity. But on the other hand, the American Secret Service agents noticed that during certain seasons the reception of radio signals from the east was better than during the rest of the year. After a while, the culprit was found. It was a huge Ferris wheel of the annual German-American Volksfest festival. From then on, the Ferris wheel was left standing for some time after the festival was over. I really like those stories because they are written by life. The field station continued to operate until the fall of the Berlin Wall, but after that it was closed and the equipment was removed. The buildings remained in place. Today you can visit the facility. In addition, there have been several ideas to develop this area. For instance, to open a hotel or something like that. But so far, all plans have failed. Here we are at the Brandenburg Gate, again. As I've already said, the gate is in the center of our tour, and now I'd like to continue the story that we have started in the first part. Since the construction of the Berlin Wall, the gate had completely lost its real purpose, because it was walled in the shadow of a border on the east side. The longer the division lasted, the quieter it became around the building. One of the rare highlights was certainly the famous speech by US President Ronald Reagan in June 1987 in front of the gate. In his speech, Reagan asked the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, to open the gate and to tear down this wall.
Where east meets west in the divided city, the most powerful leader of the Western world today looked helplessly across the wall to the other side. After hopes in Venice of soon signing a nuclear arms treaty with Mr. Gorbachev, President Reagan, under the watchful eyes of East German border guards on the Brandenburg Gate, hurled down this challenge to the Soviet leader.
If you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Rapturous applause from West Berliners, but communist authorities condemned Mr. Reagan's speech, saying it will only make the wall higher. With over 10,000 police deployed today for the president's visit, there was hardly a demonstrator in sight after the violence overnight. Anti-American protesters who went on the rampage clashed in a series of street battles with baton-wielding police using tear gas and water cannon. More than 100 police and demonstrators were injured, as many again were arrested.
It was not until the peaceful revolution in the GDR in November 1989 that the Brandenburg Gate again attracted the attention of the world public. Since autumn of that year, large parts of the population in the GDR had developed an increasing dissatisfaction with the political leadership of the state. It was about the miserable economic conditions, but also about political demands for real democracy, for freedom of expression, and for the freedom of the press. When the Berlin Wall fell on November the 9th, initially people from the west climbed the fortifications at the Brandenburg Gate, because on the eastern side, border soldiers held their positions. In addition, there was no border crossing at the gate. But in the course of the night, people from East Berlin also overcame the security systems, and they met together on the top of a wall. The pictures of it went around the world, and they had a very symbolic meaning.
East Germany has finally given up trying to control its people. 50,000 have fled through Czechoslovakia in the past week. From now on, they'll be able to cross directly into West Germany with a minimum of formalities. Few details are yet available of what is clearly a rushed decision by the new Politburo. The bombshell announcement, which reverses 40 years of hardline policy, came from the Politburo spokesman, Günter Schabowski.
This movement of people is going on over a friendly country, which isn't at all easy for that country. And therefore we've decided to invoke a ruling which would allow every citizen of the East German Republic to emigrate through East German border posts.
The announcement means that the Berlin Wall, the ultimate symbol of the Cold War, is suddenly a redundant structure. The entire fortified border with West Germany is a waste of money and manpower. This is the middle of the checkpoint. The police are making no attempt to stop people. The gates have been thrown open and thousands of people are pouring over to take a look at a West. In some cases, their first look, and the elation is enormous. But these were not people abandoning their country. Most were simply heading for the night out of their lives. They discovered what was happening by watching West German television, and they'd come running, as they were, to join the party. But the narrow opening allowed by these Germans wasn't enough to cope with the press of people. Some started to climb over the fence itself, others found another way through it.
Playing a little with the fence.
Did you ever expect to do this?
No, never.
What do you think of tonight?
It's wonderful. That's what we waited for.
And then they forced open another gate and piled through it. It was a cheerfully anarchic night. Obstacles were unceremoniously removed. The border was no longer sacrosanct, and its guardians were flabbergasted. In the centre of divided Berlin, the Brandenburg Gate straddles the border, normally forbidden to people from both sides. Troops stand guard over it, but tonight they too were to be forced away by people power. And once the troops had gone, Berliners from both east and west linked hands and danced round their liberated territory. And behind them, people scrambled playfully up and down on the Berlin Wall itself, something they used to be shot for.
Have fun. You want out? Here. Adam, give me a hand. Let me go say hi to Axel.
East Berliners can come to West Berlin, and West Berliners can go to East Berlin without visa. It's great.
It is somewhat ironic that in 1989 expectations were fulfilled that had already been formulated by Western politicians in the 1950s. Back then, it was said that Berlin would be the key, or let me say, the bridgehead to unification. This idea explained the very symbolic power of the Brandenburg Gate. And that is exactly what actually happened 40 years later, when most Germans had already lost the hope of reunification. Sometimes history has its own rules, hasn't it? Now we are at the end of our tour. We have visited several places, exciting places, that were important for the Cold War in a divided city. Some of these places may have been familiar to you, others may have been new. I hope that I was able to give you some impressions that will help you to get a better understanding of the complexity of the German question after 1945. At first glance, many of the things we have talked about seem very far away from our time and from our everyday lives, but they are not. The events happened only 40 or 50 years ago. That's just the blink of an eye, and the shadows of the past are very long. With this in mind, I wish you a few more nice days at Zaru, exciting insights, and all the best. Bye. Hello everyone. Cool. Scheiße, wohin jetzt? Verdammt. Today you can visit the facility. In addition, there have been several ideas to redevelop. To develop. Okay, nochmal von vorn. Komme ich jetzt ins Fernsehen?
Da sind Sie schon drin. Hier ist alles live, alles live.
Alles live. Jetzt.
glaube ich auch nicht.
Womöglich nicht. Sag mal was? Jetzt, jetzt ja. Ton läuft.
Kamera auch.
Ah, scheiße. Okay.
Outtakes, die dritte.